Evening, everyone. I'm Keith Mahoney with the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Long-Term Control Plan Citywide Modeling Meeting. Thanks. Tonight's meeting is being hosted by both the New York City DEP as well as the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Over the last 10 years, DEP has invested over $21 billion in both wastewater and water projects, $1 billion of which has been spent on the biological nitrogen removal program, upgrades to treatment plants in both the Jamaica Bay and the Upper East River required under a consent judgment with the DEC. To date, we've already reduced nitrogen into the Upper East River by 50%, nitrogen into Jamaica Bay by 30%, and project is still ongoing. We still have also $125 million in future projects for BNR reduction, and our ultimate goal is we'll have reductions over 60% into the Upper East River, and we're projecting over 50% into reductions in Jamaica Bay. Aside from that is the CSO program. To date, we spent over $2 billion on the CSO program. This includes some large infrastructure projects, such as the Pattagat Bay CSO facility, a 50 million gallon retention basin in Pattagat Basin in Brooklyn. It also has a 43 million gallon CSO retention facility in Flushing Creek. Aside from this, DEP has another $1.6 billion over the next 10 years of additional CSO projects that will fulfill its requirement in the current 2012 CSO order with the New York State DEC. Of this $1.6 billion, over $700 million of that will be spent on green infrastructure projects. Tonight is actually looking at the CSO program, the next steps of the CSO program beyond what was already committed in that 2012 order. So what we really want to do is get the public involved early on, give everyone an overview of the different water quality models we use, the different landside models that we'll be using, as well as the underlying assumptions that we're going to use to evaluate all these future alternatives, making sure it's representative of real conditions, and we want to evaluate everything on an equivalent basis. The speakers tonight will be Gary Klein from the New York State DEC, Linda Allen with the New York State DEC, as well as Sri Rangarajan with the New York City DEP, sorry Sri, and Thomas Newman with HDR Hydroqual. We'll ask that, we want to go through the presentation, so we figured we'd go through half the presentation, take some questions, then do the remaining presentation, take some additional questions. We'll also have cards you can write questions down on. We'll try to answer some tonight. We'll also post the remaining ones onto the DEP website. There's also handout materials that we provided. We have boards around the room that we can discuss after this meeting if you're interested. And with that being said, I'm going to hand this over to Gary Klein. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. How's everybody? Good. I usually like to start with a small joke or a little anecdote, but I've got a real bad cold. I was on vacation last week, and this is my punishment. But I did bring my Senator Rubio prop, so if you see me using it, it's because I have a bad cold. So I got it in anyway. I just want to spend a few minutes because the presentations are going to be quite involved, technical in nature, and it really requires your close attention. And I hope you come up with some good questions. Just to mention a couple of things, as many of you are aware, that last March we entered into a modification to our CSO order with New York City. And there's three really, I think, important things that have come out of that modification to the CSO order. The first being, and why we're here tonight, the first being is that we have a timetable now for the city to complete long-term control plans. I think that's critical. We didn't have that before, the firm dates. I think that's a very important step. In the next 4 years, there's going to be an awful lot of work done to complete all the long-term control plans for the water bodies in the city's jurisdiction. Secondly, it resolved a long-standing issue that we've had over the water quality planning endpoints for these long-term control plans with a very clear goal statement that was also endorsed by EPA Region 2. So I think that's something that was a very important accomplishment from that order. And thirdly, of course, is I call it the very artfully way we integrated the city's green infrastructure program into the long-term control plan process. We've done this by allowing the city a baseline CSO reduction for these long-term control plans, and that is going to be applied against an overall citywide GI application goal. And you can see that in the consent order. All these things are available on the city's website. I think that was a major accomplishment. I know the city likes to talk about it, and we're also very proud of how that worked out. I'd like to make a minute to acknowledge the months and months of efforts that have gone into this, which you're going to see tonight in this presentation, for these the models that are going into these long-term control plans. The professional staff at DEP and their consultants have done amazing things over the last several months to get ready for tonight. And finally, I'd like to talk about us for just a second. I know that many of you are aware that DEC has experienced quite the drain of professional people and institutional knowledge over the last decade or so. However, we can say for certain that this program, and I'm confident that the department has given us all the resources we need to complete very informed, highly technical reviews, and to oversee the city's process under the CSO order that they signed last March. DEC will continue to evaluate these models and the assumptions you're about to see in the presentation from DEP. We haven't got to the point where we've endorsed them yet, and we're still having discussions with the city and seeking your input as a part of that process before we get to that point. And with that, I'd like to introduce one of my key members, in fact, the key member on my team looking at these things, and that's Linda Allen. She is a world-class engineer who's practiced all over the world, water and wastewater projects, you name it, everywhere. And she's going to briefly describe the long-term control plan process for you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Welcome. Let me see here. Is this the Keith? Is this the?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to be going over a little bit on the CSO process and guidance that the city is going to be using as they develop their long-term control plans. And for some of you who've attended some of these public meetings in the past, this will be a little bit familiar to you, so I don't really want to go into too much depth, but I'll hit just kind of the key points. Because the city has a combined sewer system in the majority of their sewer collection system, they're required under their speedies permits from the state to complete long-term control plans, and these are required actually under the Clean Water Act and the federal CSO control policy that was developed in 1994. And as Gary mentioned, the city has specific time frames for completing long-term control plans. Over the next 4 years, there'll be 11 long-term control plans completed for different water bodies, culminating in a citywide long-term control plan in 2017. And what these plans are really a comprehensive evaluation of the long-term solutions that the city can implement to reduce CSOs and to improve water quality in the water bodies throughout the city. And what the city will be ultimately trying to achieve is the water body specific standards that conform to the long-term control the LTCP federal policy and the water quality goals of the Clean Water Act. The process itself is spelled out in some guidance that EPA has put together, but I think it's important to recognize that, as has already been mentioned by Gary, the city has been already undertaking efforts to reduce combined sewer overflows for many years. They've invested, as Keith mentioned, billions of dollars already. And the state recognized this and has been working with the city kind of in two phases of planning. And the city has already done a lot of planning previously to reduce combined sewer overflows. The first phase of planning was documented in water body watershed facility plans. And for any of you who've been involved following this process, you probably attended some of the meetings where those documents were presented to the public. And we approved the state approved the last water body watershed plan this year. And so now the next phase of planning, which is the actual completion of a long-term control plan, is what's in process now. The ultimate goal is to achieve the water quality goals of the Clean Water Act. Now, many of the water bodies that the city will be evaluating that are CSO impacted currently are not classified at that high of a standard. So as the city goes through this process, what they're going to be evaluating and assessing is the feasibility of actually attaining the current water quality standards for these water bodies, the next highest standards, and then ultimately the fishable, swimmable goals of the Clean Water Act. And the overall plan, the alternatives that the city will be looking at are a combination of what we call green and gray infrastructure. And what each water body, each LTCP will do is try and identify a specific balance of those different types of technologies to improve the water quality to the maximum extent possible. And this process will involve, obviously, very robust public participation throughout the time that they're developing these plans. As I mentioned, the water bodies that the city is focusing on that are CSO impacted are not all classified the same. So they're not all starting at the same point in terms of when they start to develop these long-term control plans. And this slide here gives you an indication of the different classifications for these water bodies at present. And you can see here, very briefly, the red colored water bodies like Newtown Creek and I can't remember, Gowanus are very low classified at the lowest level. Those are SD. And as you move up the chart there, the orange is a slightly higher classification. And what they deal with is whether the water body is capable of supporting aquatic life or is capable of supporting primary or secondary recreation contact. And ultimately, for purposes of the LTCPs, the goal would be to get the water bodies up to either a yellow or a green classification, or meet the standards of those classifications. And as you can see, many of the water bodies are either orange or red. You know, the Jamaica Bay is a yellow, so that is currently classified as that to meet the fishable, swimmable goals. But it's important. I think this slide really highlights, though, the variability that the city is facing in terms of developing these long-term control plans, given the existing standards, existing water quality conditions in them, and the previous efforts that they've already undertaken. So that is kind of the starting point for them when they start to do these long-term control plans. Although the city is currently just kind of starting the process for developing the long-term control plans, there's been guidance out there that was developed by EPA in 1994 when they first initiated the process at the federal level for communities that have combined sewer overflows to develop these plans. But as I mentioned, the city has been doing planning throughout this period. So this really this guidance has been something they have been following all along, and they'll continue to follow it. But basically, the 1994 guidance outlines what is the substantive content, what are the major elements that these plans have to include. And I'm not going to go over each one of these. There's 9 major elements, but really the city has to document what their system is physically. They have to evaluate the alternatives of how they can make changes within the system to reduce combined sewer overflows and improve water quality. They look at cost factors, they look at operational factors, they have to have a plan for implementation, and they also have to have a plan for monitoring the water quality once they've completed their projects. And all that is going to be spelled out in these long-term control plans. The purpose of tonight's meeting is really to talk about the modeling, and that's a very key element of the long-term control process. planning process, because that's how they really do a lot of the technical analyses, is using computer models. And you'll get, I think, a very good idea tonight on in terms of what the city is using, the different models. The other key guidance that the EPA has developed to help communities that are doing long-term control planning is guidance that that helps them coordinate the planning process for reducing CSOs with water quality standard reviews. And the reason that this is important is that there may be instances where the completed plan does not result in a water body achieving its water quality, the fishable swimmable goals of the Clean Water Act. And if that's the case, then there'll need to be a water quality standards review. I mean, ultimately, that is the goal, though, is for these plans to look at assessing how they can achieve different levels of standards, but ultimately the idea would be to try and achieve the fishable swimmable goals of the Clean Water Act. If, though, there's a water body where the city either is not capable, where it's currently not classified as a fishable swimmable at those high of standards as fishable swimmable, and the city is not capable of meeting the existing standards, or where the city is not capable of meeting the fishable swimmable goals, they will be required to undertake a use attainability analysis. And this is an evaluation looking at basically what is the highest attainable use of this water body. And once they have determined that, then in conjunction with the state would then look at that and adjust the water quality standards, classifications or criteria, and develop a water body specific criteria that would then be used for that water body. And that is going to be all kind of wrapped up into this whole process of planning for the CSOs. And again, as with this entire process, these use attainability analyses will also involve a robust process for public participation, because it's a critical thing to involve the community who lives near and uses these water bodies to be involved in the process for determining what the highest attainable use is for them. So that's it. That's all I had, and I guess I'll turn it back over to Keith to introduce the next speaker, or Shri. Just say Shri.